The title I gave to this Bible study was Matthew 24 and 25, Points to Ponder. So we're basically going to be Matthew 24 and 25, which I think is appropriate for Bible study, just to stay primarily in one area of the Bible. And probably for many of us, perhaps most of us, Matthew 24 and 25 are very familiar chapters of the Bible. And we look at them particularly in the context of prophecy, and a lot of things, a lot of sermons, a lot of articles that we have heard and read over the years dealing with these very chapters. And as I said, I just jotted down a few points that I wanted to share with you as friends, share with you as maybe starting points for discussion. I realize this isn't interactive, but perhaps afterwards some of you may want to explore some of these points further, or not, as the case may be. First thing I put down, and this is just a general comment about specifically the King James Version, because a lot of us still use the King James Version. Just for interest's sake, how many of you still, at least from time to time, will refer to the King James Version in your own study? Okay, right. And I do too. I have my King James Bible at home, and I refer to that because it has all my notes in that, marginal notes. So a lot of stuff is in there that I did not copy into other Bibles. So it's there. It's kind of my reference Bible. But a lot of us still use it. And of course, a lot of verses that we memorized from the King James Version. And it has a certain poetry. It's a little bit like when you think of Shakespeare. You remember some quotations from Shakespeare, and you remember quotations from the King James Version. And of course, we have to be careful there because English, like every other language, changes. The meanings of words change. And sometimes we realize that, we're aware of that, and sometimes we're not. You know, during our lifetime, for instance, we know, and I don't mean to offend anyone here, but we know, for example, the meaning of the word gay has changed. You know, you could say, I feel gay today, back when I was a kid. That meant one thing. It means something entirely different today. So languages change, meanings of words change, even though the word is still there. And the word that I'm thinking of in this context is the word watch. The word watch. And we have used that word, and we've referred to that word many, many times. And in fact, I think my previous association, the previous association of many of you, would emphasize the importance of watching. Correct? Is that mine? Okay, thank you. And what I wanted to say is, and I've written about this as well, is that the verb watch in the King James is not transitive. Is not transitive. It does not require an object. Modern usage, the word watch, the verb watch, does require an object, or we expect it to require an object. What I mean by that is, if I say watch today, your likely response is to say, watch what? What do you want me to watch, right? You want me to watch a movie, watch television, watch what? I need to watch something. In the King James, when it says watch, all it means is stay awake. That's it. Stay awake. Stay alert. Greek, gregoreo. There's no watching anything. So when we read that, or when back in the day, whoever, whether it was Herbert Armstrong or somebody else read watch, they're saying, we must be watching something. And of course, that led to watching world events. Now, watching world events is perfectly fine. I mean, I'm a news junkie. I like to know what's going on. And many of you are too. And I don't feel there's anything wrong with that. But I don't say, well, I'm doing that because of what it says in Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. I do it just because I'm interested. Not because I feel there's a biblical requirement to do that. Because there certainly isn't in Matthew 24 and 25. And let me just do a thought experiment while we're talking about this. Let's go back to the first century when these words were written. Let's go back 2,000 years to when these words were written, and they're quoting, of course, the words of Jesus. How did news travel in the first century? Did the disciples check their Facebook feed to see what's on there? Or, Twitter, or any of the tools that we have available to us today? I work and teach high school, and some of the students have told me they get their news primarily, because I asked, and at least the ones I asked, that they get their news primarily from Twitter. That's how they get their news. They don't get their news from newspapers. Now, I grew up, of course, with newspapers. We always had a subscription at home, sometimes more than one paper, and I'm still a diehard newspaper subscriber. And in part, I feel it's because I want newspapers to survive. I don't want them to die, so I still do that. But people can tell my age because they see me reading a newspaper. It's only people of a certain age usually who read newspapers, right? Physical paper. If you're younger than a certain age, you don't do that. But anyway, going back to the first century, how did news travel? Did people have a newspaper subscription? Did news somehow get reported on a daily basis? Well, you just think about how do we get news? News that's happening thousands of miles away, which it usually is. We have the means to communicate instantaneously around the world. That was not always possible. In fact, I think we really just have to go back a couple of centuries, maybe to the telegraph, the invention of the telegraph, where finally we start to be able to get news very, very quickly. Otherwise, news got to you as fast as the fastest means of transportation, whether that was on horseback, usually, or some other means, sometimes on foot. We sometimes forget these things. Just as I said, I talk about history, I teach history. But in the U.S. at one time, and before we basically had encompassed the whole continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, how did people travel? And how long did it take? Well, by one calculation, I was trying to figure out, how fast the fastest horse would be able to go for extended distances. Anyway, my calculation came up with, okay, if you were going to ride across the United States, 3,000 miles on horseback, on a good horse, take you about 5 months. About 5 months, across the whole country. All right? Now, once railroads were established, and you had the Transcontinental Railroad, well, you could do it with a good train, maybe in about 5 days. Right? So from 5 months to 5 days, that's pretty good progress. Now, of course, we can cross on a plane in about 5 hours, correct? And news, of course, takes much less than 5 seconds to cross the country. And so it's very tempting to think that people have always had this kind of immediate access to things, because that's the time that we live in. But back in the first century, news was, I dare say, sporadic. You would hear, oh yeah, there was a tower that fell in Siloam, killed a bunch of people, right? But you'd get the news days or maybe even a week or two after it happened. Obviously, news in the local community would be instantaneous. But otherwise, it would take a long time. You'd hear important stuff from Rome. Oh, they have a new emperor. That news would travel. But what else would you hear about? Maybe you might hear later on, oh yes, there was a volcano that erupted there in Rome, near Rome somewhere, killed a bunch of people. Yeah, that was terrible. And yeah, there was an earthquake I heard about, happened a few months ago. But that would be it, right? What would be your daily news feed? It would be what's happening in the community, right? That would be about it. And for many of us, that would be kind of boring. which, by the way, I think is one of the powerful incentives to gossip, right? Because we can't find news. We want news about our neighbors and the people we know. And have you heard? Did you hear what so-and-so did? So I think gossip was probably even a bigger temptation then than it is now. Now we just gossip about the news. But my point is this. If Jesus here in Matthew 24 and 25 is telling people to watch world events, it's got to be boring, what world events? He's not. I hope I'm making it clear that that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that at all. So whenever we see the word watch, and I think modern translations replace that translation with the word stay awake or the word alert, stay alert. So that's what we need to do. It's not watching world events. So if you're building some kind of prophecy framework, saying, hey, well, I'm told Jesus told us to watch. No, he didn't. Jesus never said watch world events. He said watch, meaning stay awake. Why do you have to stay awake? Because you don't know when the thief is coming in to break into your house. So you stay awake to catch him or prevent the thief from coming in. That's the idea. You stay awake. All right, another thought that I want to throw out there, I said points to ponder, and I better keep track of the time. Chapter and verse division, right? We have chapters and verses in the Bible. Great study tool, because it makes it much easier to reference things, and then we can check for ourselves. I mean, where would we be without chapters and verses? It'd be a lot harder, right? But chapter and verse division dates back to just the 13th century. So for well over 1,000 years, when people, obviously not everybody had access to a Bible, there was no printing press and so on, but the few that did, you had this different books and different scrolls, but they weren't divided into chapters and verses as we have them now. So the chapter and verse division was not divinely inspired that I know of, but it was a tool. It's a tool of convenience. It makes it easier to read in the same way that nowadays we tend to have shorter paragraphs. You look at writings from the 19th century from newspapers, and they're just solid text, and it's hard to read, at least for modern readers. So we break things up into short paragraphs that are much easier on the eye, easier to read. And so there's convenience. And sometimes when I get text and I'm sharing it with a student, as old text, I will break it up into paragraphs just to make it easier. So these things are convenient, but they're not inspired. They're just decisions made by people. Hey, this seems to be following one theme. We'll put it together as a chapter or as a section. And so the reason for my mentioning that is because chapters 24 and 25 go together. They go together. There really is no divinely inspired division at the end of 24 and the beginning of 25. You need to, I submit to you, put them all together as we read them and we understand them. They're dealing with one theme. The theme is here in Matthew 24. Well, let's just start reading here in Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple, was walking away when his disciples came and pointed to the temple buildings. Very impressive building project that Herod had accomplished. He answered, "Yes, look at it all. Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. They will all be thrown down." I imagine that was a pretty stunning statement for the disciples to hear. You see some very solid looking building, and not just solid, very imposing, and because of the association with worship, you would think permanent. I mean, this thing has got to be here for a long time, and yet he's just said it's going to be thrown away. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, facing the temple, so he goes a distance away, the disciples came to speak to him privately. And I think in Luke, the parallel chapter gives the specifics. It's either Luke or Mark, I forget it right now. And they said, "Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So when will this happen? When will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So how many questions is that? I mean, it could be one question. Are they thinking of it as one question? Is it two? Is it three? I mean, we could break it down to three questions. When will this happen? Could be one question, correct? When will the temple be destroyed? Another question could be, what will be the sign of your coming? Now, presumably, we're assuming that the disciples thought, well, if the temple is going to be destroyed, that could only mean that Jesus is coming back. They understood that, and that ties in as well with the end of the age. But we have to be careful not to assume that all three are the same thing. I mean, they could coincide, but let's not make that assumption a priori. Let's look and see if everything fits. So there's a list of things that Jesus goes through. And so what is the message? Now we could go through these. Let's do that. I'll take a little bit of time. I think we have time for this. Jesus replied, "Take care that no one misleads you." And of course, it's interesting that that's the very first thing he says. So I think that would be a warning, wouldn't it? That it would be very easy to be misled about what will happen if particularly you're asking about your coming, the end of the age. By the way, has that happened in history? Have disciples ever been misled about that? Yes? Has anyone ever said, hey, I've got it all figured out and I can tell you when Jesus is coming? Has that ever happened? I would say it's happened aplenty. For many will come claiming my name and saying, I'm the Messiah. Many will be misled by them. The time is coming when you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Okay? Now, they're living through a time that historians label Pax Romana. You know, the Romans were able to conquer much of the known world, particularly in the West, and because they were the overlords and the rulers, they could establish peace. They could impose peace. So there weren't necessarily many conflicts. So maybe, does this suggest an increase in those wars and rumors of wars? On the other hand, when has human history been devoid of wars and rumors of wars? I mean, can any of you think back? And I'm not, I don't say, oh yeah, Mr. Avery's in the back. Of course, he can go back very far, not just in the room, but in history, because he was there. But at any time, is there a time when we just were, has a century gone by without wars? I mean, I can't think of one. I think that's something that would continue. So is that by itself going to give us any clear indication? No, I think this is just normal for human beings. It's just normal to have wars and rumors of war, isn't it? I mean, even after World War II, when the United Nations was established in an effort to prevent war. Now, you might argue that we've been successful in preventing a world war, but they're not successful in preventing many other wars, smaller wars, but still deadly. See that you are not alarmed. Such things are bound to happen, but the end is still to come. And I dare say he's mentioning wars because very often, I imagine if you are in a war situation, it seems like the end must be near. Because that's how wars affect people. They kill. And so you would tend to be alarmed. The end is still to come. He said, that's not it. That's not the sign. Verse 7, nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. What else? There will be famines and earthquakes in many places. I remember some years ago, someone sent me a news clipping about more earthquakes happening now than before and whatever, and asked me to check into it. Well, I looked into that, And I forget the organization that keeps track of earthquakes and tries to go back in history, of course, and not that people kept records all the way through the centuries, but essentially the thrust of the research I did came up with the idea that, you know what, we're having just about the same number of earthquakes as we've ever had. Not any greater number, you know, they go up and down, but there's nothing unusual. Now, obviously, if we have an earthquake locally, that's unusual, you know, and it affects us personally, and so it's a big deal. But all these things are the first birth pangs of the new age. So Jesus is indicating that the new age is about to begin. But when did that new age begin? It began with him. His death and resurrection initiated a new age. So all these things would continue now, they didn't know this. We know it because we're living 2,000 years on, but these things would continue for at least 2,000 years. Now, verse 9 seems to indicate something a little bit more specific. And he says, you'll be handed over for punishment and execution. And he seems to be addressing them directly. His disciples, those who are asking him privately, and by extension, the other believers. All nations will hate you for your allegiance to me, and at that time many will fall from their faith. They will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. And as lawlessness spreads, the love of many will grow cold. But whoever endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the earth as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Then the end will come. Okay, is this the end, meaning the end of human civilization? It could indeed be an allusion to that. But what does he continue explaining or describing? In verse 15, he says, so when you see the abomination of desolation of which the prophet Daniel spoke, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And in Luke uses specifically Jerusalem surrounded by armies. He gets to be specific. And if you go back to Daniel, of course, Daniel is referencing, at least most commentators would agree, Antiochus Epiphanes and his desecration of the temple. Then those who are in Judea must take to the hills. Now, this did happen historically in the late 60s and culminated in AD 70, when the Romans came after the latest rebellion by the Jews and essentially defeated them and destroyed the temple. So this appears to be a reference to that specific historic event. Those who are in Judea must take to the hills. If anyone is on the roof, he must not go down to fetch his goods from the house. If anyone is in the field, he must not turn back for his coat. Alas for women with child in those days and for those who have children at the breast. Pray that it may not be winter or a Sabbath when you have to make your escape. It will be a time of great distress, such as there has never been before since the beginning of the world and will never be again. If that time of troubles were not cut short, no living thing could survive, but for the sake of God's chosen, it will be cut short. And so this whole section seems to be talking about the fact that, in this case, the Romans were going to destroy the temple. Those stones that would be all overturned, thrown down, that would occur under the Romans. Within 40 years of the statements made here by Jesus. And clearly that was a time of great distress, and presumably the greatest distress the people then living had ever experienced. Now, will there be something parallel in the future? Possibly. But we have to be careful about making those assumptions. Then, of course, at that time, people would be thinking, well, that Jesus must be coming back now. If the temple's destroyed, that period of worship at the temple, temple-based worship is being ended, then it must mean that Jesus is coming back. And he says in verse 23, if anyone says to you then, look, here's the Messiah, there he is, don't believe it. Impostors will come, claiming to be messiahs or prophets. They'll produce great signs and wonders to mislead, if possible, even God's chosen. See, I have forewarned you. If therefore they tell you he's in the wilderness, don't go out. If they say he's in the inner room, don't believe it. Like a lightning flash that lights the sky from east to west will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the carcass is, there will the vultures gather. So what I take out of this section is, if people are telling you that Jesus has come, you don't really need to be told, because you will see it. It will be evident in the same way that lightning is evident clearly. Or if you see vultures or birds of prey circling, you know that there's a carcass there. There's no question about it. It will be absolutely, incontrovertibly clear to everybody. You don't have to be in the know. You don't have to be part of this secret group that we know what's really going on. You don't have to be a Gnostic or whatever. You will see it. And as soon as that time of distress is past, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars will fall from the sky, the celestial powers will be shaken, and then will appear in heaven the sign that heralds the Son of Man. And so this very clearly is indicating Jesus' return. So this could well be a jump from AD 70 to whenever Jesus is going to return. And later on, I think I'll have time to read a passage in the Old Testament that hopefully illustrates that. In the other message, Mr. Haver had said the messages that I give don't have to be related. They can be. They don't have to be. And I said, well, can they be second cousins? And yeah, that would work. So, maybe the other message is related in that context. All the peoples of the world will make lamentation, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And that will be obvious to everybody. You won't need a news alert. With a trumpet blast, he will send out his angels. They will gather his chosen from the four winds, from the farthest bounds of heaven on every side. Learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its tender shoots appear and are breaking into leaf, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you may know that the end is near, at the very door. Truly, I tell you, the present generation, so this seems to be going back to what happened in AD 70. The present generation will live to see it all. So the present generation, when he's talking to them, many of them would have lived to AD 70. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But of course, he's also warning about how people will mislead, will claim to be in the know, and it will be possible for any of us to be fooled into believing that certain things are happening that are not necessarily happening. Because look at this verse here in verse 37. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be when the Son of Man comes. And how was it in those days? We know the story. Noah was given instructions to build an ark to save his family from destruction. But what was life like for everybody else? In the days before the flood, verse 38, they ate and drank and married until the day that Noah went into the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. That is how it will be when the Son of Man comes. So the idea there is that life will continue as it always has, with all its ups and downs. And so I think we need to keep that in mind, that there won't necessarily be, hey, we have extra number of earthquakes this year, and we seem to have a little greater number of wars and so on. That must be the indicator. It caught people by surprise. I mean, you would think that in Noah's day, and of course the assumption is here he is building an ark in the desert, a ship in the desert. People would maybe initially say, you're crazy, what are you doing that for? There's no water for miles around. And he'd explain, and they would laugh and disregard it, and maybe after a while it just became kind of a tourist thing. Hey, look at crazy Noah building his ark. But they went on with their lives, because he goes on to say in verse 40, then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, the other left, 2 women grinding in the mill, one taken, the other left. And then he says, verse 42, watch in the King James. My version here says, keep awake, because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. Remember, if the householder had known at what time of night the burglar was coming, he would have stayed awake, not let his house be broken into. Hold yourselves ready, therefore, because the Son of Man will come at the time you least expect him. You least expect him. And so that says to me, if you're trying to figure out when to expect him, that's kind of a wild goose chase. Yeah, you're wasting your time. What should you be doing? Verse 45, who is the faithful and wise servant charged by his master to manage his household and supply them with food at the proper time? Happy that servant if his master comes home and finds him at work. You've got a job to do, so get on with it. Don't worry about trying to figure all these things out. Truly I tell you, he will be put in charge of all his master's property, but if he's a bad servant, says to himself, the master is a long time coming. And who is more likely to say that? Someone who is trying to figure everything out and gets it wrong time after time? Or someone who's just busy doing what he needs to be doing? I tend to think it's the fellow who's trying to figure everything out and says, well, maybe he's not going to come for a long time, and begins to bully the other servants and to eat and drink with his drunken friends. Then the master will arrive on a day when the servant does not expect him, at a time he has not been told. And he will cut him in pieces and assign him a place among the hypocrites, where there is wailing and grinding of teeth. And then it continues right on. As I said, there's not a chapter break that was inspired here. And when the day comes, the kingdom of heaven will be like this, like 10, in the King James, 10 virgins, 10 girls in this version, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 prudent. When the foolish ones took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the others took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was a long time in coming, they all dozed off to sleep. And that's an important point, I believe. Because if Jesus is saying, stay awake, humanly speaking, how long can we stay awake and alert? After a number of hours, we start to get drowsy, don't we? We start to fall asleep. And in this case, literally, even the wise fell asleep. So the expectation is not that you're not going to fall asleep, literally, physically, you are. But are you going to be ready? At midnight there came a shout, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Then all the girls got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, our lamps are going out, give us some of your oil. No, they answered, there will never be enough for all of us. You'd better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves. Now this is not meant to be understood literally, but there's a lesson here about preparation, about doing what you need to be doing when you have the opportunity. And while they were away, the bridegroom arrived, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others came back. Sir, sir, open the door for us, they cried. But he answered, truly I tell you, I don't know you. Keep awake then, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Watch, therefore, as it says in the King James. By the way, what is it about knowing neither the day nor the hour that we don't understand? You know not the day or the hour. I mean, if you don't know it, does wanting to know it make me know it? Does figuring things out from the news make me know it? I don't see that. It says you don't know. You don't know. Then he goes on into the parable of, depending on your translation, talents. different servants were given different amounts, and some who produce, and one in particular, who doesn't produce. And I'm trying to cut short because I realize the time. But then he goes into verse 31. Verse 31. And this narration here, this account, I believe, explains to us what we should be doing. So again, this is the context of both Matthew 24 and 25, trying to figure out what's going to be the sign of your coming, and Jesus is adding here, and this is what you need to be doing. You need to stay awake. And how do you stay awake? How do you stay alert? He talks about, verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne with all the nations gathered before him, and separate people into two groups, as a shepherd separates the sheep into goats, sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. The king will say to those on his right, "You have my Father's blessing. Come, take possession of the kingdom that has been ready for you since the world was made. For when I was hungry, you gave me food. When thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you took me into your home. When naked, you clothed me. When I was ill, you came to my help. When in prison, you visited me." Now please notice, in that list, nowhere does he say, "And when I said no one knows the day or the hour, you had it all figured out. You knew exactly when I was coming." Doesn't say that. And the righteous reply, verse 37, "Lord, when? When did we see you hungry and fed you, or thirsty and gave you drink, a stranger and took you home, or naked and clothed you? When did we see you ill or in prison and come to visit?" We don't recall doing that to you. And the king will answer, "Truly I tell you, anything you did for one of my brothers here, however insignificant, you did for me." And then he will say to those on his left, "A curse is on you. Go from my sight to the eternal fire that is ready for the devil and his angels. For when I was hungry, you gave me nothing to eat. When thirsty, nothing to drink. When I was a stranger, you did not welcome me. When I was naked, you did not clothe me. When I was ill and in prison, you did not come to my help." They in turn will say the same thing. When did we see you in need and not help you? And he will say, verse 45, "Truly I tell you, anything you failed to do for one of these, however insignificant, you failed to do for me." And they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous will enter eternal life. So Jesus is saying we need to be busy doing what? What is it that the 5 wise girls or the 5 wise virgins were doing that made them ready when the call came, "Bridegroom is here"? They were busy as they saw the opportunity to take care of the needs of others, take care of the needs of their brothers and sisters. So rather than trying to figure out dates, this is what we should be doing. What is more important, figuring out dates or loving our mates? Or maybe mates in the Aussie sense, meaning friends. And so we need to be combating, I believe that this section is telling us that we need to be combating an absence of caring. And I've known many people in the churches of God over the years, and some very, very fine individuals, but whose time was largely spent, or much of their time, maybe not largely, maybe in terms of individual chunks, a lot of it was spent trying to figure out dates and prophecy and all that stuff. And so they neglected some other things that might have been more important, more needful. And that could be a trap that any of us can fall into. So we need to be caring for the needs of others day in, day out, our whole life long. And it's not necessarily glamorous or exciting. You know, sometimes we're all attracted to something glamorous like prophecy and figuring out dates, because there is a certain excitement about that. And so taking care of the needs of others you remember the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. You know, there he is, he encounters this wounded person, and there's nobody else around, so is he waiting for the news reporter to show up, to take some pictures, or someone to, you know, film it on his camera so that it can be posted and he can get a claim? No, it's quiet. It's done without caring about publicity. It's done because it needs to be done. It's ordinary, it's mundane. So we do those things without seeking publicity or recognition. That's what the sheep were doing. They didn't even know that they were doing it. It had become just such a part of their daily way of life that they didn't even think about it. They didn't think they were doing anything special. They were thinking, well, you know, it says to love God and then to love your neighbor as yourself. And love my brethren and my potential prospective brethren, because frankly, every single individual is a prospective brother or sister, even if he or she is not technically a brother or sister right now. A final scripture in 1 John, I said I'd stay in Matthew 24:25, and I did for most of the time, but if we could go here just to conclude, 1 John 4:20 and 21. 1 John 4:20. What is more, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. 1 John 4:20. But if someone says, I love God, while at the same time hating his fellow Christian, he is a liar. If he does not love a fellow Christian whom he has seen, he is incapable of loving God whom he has not seen. We have this command from Christ: whoever loves God must love his fellow Christian too. And those goats there in Matthew 24 say, well, we didn't see you. When did we see you having these needs and didn't help you? Well, they didn't see him because they didn't see him in the people who were needy. You see, how we see and how we treat others is how we see and treat God. And so let's ponder on these points next time we read or reference Matthew 24 and 25. If you would please bow your heads. Father in heaven, thank you again for the opportunity to have the access to your word, that we have the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. Help us to appreciate them. We know that our brethren in other parts of the world don't have such freedoms, and we pray for them and for deliverance. And we certainly look forward to the time when your Son Jesus will return and put an end to the woes and problems of our time. But in the meantime, Father, help us to focus on what we can do and need to do every day of our lives. And let us recognize those needs and be a source of blessing and help to others as you give us the opportunity. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.